The archives of Cambridge University Library are filled with historical treasures, many of which rarely see the light of day. But when Charles Darwin's precious notebooks disappeared from the collection, it sparked a desperate hunt across the nation and beyond. Then, one day, they mysteriously reappeared accompanied by a cryptic note. An anonymous thief finally returned Charles Darwin's notebooks, but he left behind an eerie note. Almost 200 years ago, the father of evolution sat down and drew a strange shape on a page. Today, we know it as the tree of life, the model used to expound his groundbreaking theories. And to many, these pen strokes in a modest notebook represent the beginnings of one of the greatest scientific breakthroughs of all time. In the early 21st century, though, the notebooks vanished from their Cambridge home. And despite a lengthy investigation, no trace of them could be found. So how did they suddenly reappear, wrapped in a gift bag, next to a librarian's door? And what of the strange note left alongside the stolen relics? Darwin's notebooks first hit the headlines back in 2020 when Cambridge University staff realized that they disappeared. In fact, nobody had seen them in almost 2 decades. Surprisingly, though, it had taken all that time for anyone to realize that something was wrong. Given the vastness of the archives, you see, many assumed that the artifacts had simply been misplaced. After a thorough search, though, librarian Jessica Gardner was forced to accept that the valuable notebooks had gone likely the result of a theft. Speaking to the BBC in 2020, she admitted, "This is heartbreaking." Desperate to recover the items, the university appealed to the public for their immediate return. In the meantime, investigators began picking over the history of the notebooks, which are valued at several $1 million, in an attempt to track them down. According to the BBC, the last known record of the objects dated from late 2000, when they were taken from a storeroom at Cambridge University so that photos could be taken of them. Apparently, the notebooks were placed in a temporary building that had been erected while construction was being carried out at the university. After that, though, the trail went cold. And officials didn't realize that anything untoward had happened until early 2001, when a survey of the archives revealed that the artifacts had vanished. "We know that they were photographed in November 2000," Gardner explained. "But we do not know what happened between then and the time in January 2001, when it was determined that they were not in their proper place on the shelves. And I'm afraid there isn't anything on the remaining record which tells us anything more." Initially, the investigation focused on Cambridge University Library's sprawling archives, in the belief that the notebooks might simply have been lost. With over 100 miles of shelves to cover, it was a very lengthy task. But despite the best efforts of everyone involved, they came no closer to finding the truth. Years later, in 2017, Gardner took over as director of library services and so inherited the mystery of the missing notebooks. And in early 2020 she launched a fresh investigation, including a search of almost 200 boxes filled with items related to Darwin's life. But the artifacts again remained elusive. Eventually, Gardner was forced to admit the uncomfortable truth. Darwin's notebooks, it seemed, were long gone. Convinced that a crime had been committed, she contacted Cambridgeshire police, who officially registered the items as missing with Interpol in the Art Loss Register. After that, she could do nothing but hope and wait. The scientific community naturally bemoaned the loss of notebooks that had provided a unique insight into one of the 19th century's most fascinating minds. But what was so special about these aging artifacts, which are barely bigger the size of a postcard? And why did their disappearance have such an impact? By the time that Darwin put pen to paper in 1837, he was 28 years old and had just come back from a 5-year expedition on the HMS Beagle. After graduating from Christ's College in Cambridge, he'd been recommended for the voyage by John Stevens Henslow, a leading botanist of the age. From a young age, you see, Darwin had fostered an interest in the natural world, and his time on the Beagle would certainly foster that. Departing England in December 1831, the expedition set out to circumnavigate the globe, with the intention of cataloging and surveying what the team found along the way. As part of this group, Darwin documented fossils in Patagonia, climbed to the heights of the Andes Mountains, and witnessed an earthquake transform the landscape in Chile. And, of course, he also explored the Galapagos Islands, where the diverse wildlife raised a number of questions about the nature and origins of life. After coming back to England, Darwin assessed his experiences on the Beagle, mulling over the natural wonders that he'd witnessed as he traveled the world. And in his notebooks, he began to jot down his ideas, thoughts that it eventually developed into the theory of evolution. In one book, made from red leather, Darwin scribbled down the phrase "I think." And underneath, he sketched out an image that'd go on to become iconic. A basic diagram with branches jutting off in several directions, it represented the naturalist's early thoughts on evolution, a concept known as the tree of life. Over the years, Darwin continued to refine his theories, eventually completing on the origin of species in 1859. And within a few decades, his way of seeing the world had entered the academic mainstream. But it all began with a single sketch in a battered notebook, and that's why these relics are so revered today. These notebooks really are Darwin's attempt to pose to himself the question about where do species come from, what is the origin of species? Cambridge University professor Jim Secord told the BBC. It's almost like being inside Darwin's head when you're looking at these notebooks. They're jottings of all sorts of information that he's writing down. You have the sense of him working through these ideas at great speed, and that kind of intellectual energy which I think the notebooks really convey, Secord continued. I'm a fan of James Joyce, and it's always struck me that it's a bit like Leopold Bloom on steroids. You just get the sense of scientific imagination running really deep. According to reports, the content of the books had been stored digitally before their disappearance, but that didn't make the loss any easier to bear. As Secord explained, to have such an iconic object go missing is really a tragedy. And while those at Cambridge University remained hopeful that the artifacts might eventually be located, for a while the future looked bleak. Almost a year and a half after the story first made headlines, Darwin's notebooks hit the news for a second time. On March 9, a mysterious gift bag in a fetching shade of pink was left by Gardner's office. And when she peeked inside, she couldn't believe what she was seeing. There, wrapped in a layer of plastic, were the books, and something else was alongside them, too. But where had they been for the intervening 20 years? Who'd taken them? And why did they decide to leave behind a mysterious clue in the form of a cryptic note? Surprised as she was, Gardner knew that she had to be cautious. Speaking to NPR in April 2022, Secord explained she couldn't open them up right away because, of course, effectively the pink bag was a crime scene. And the police had been looking at all of that, working out what went on. At first glance, though, the notebooks appeared to be genuine and, miraculously, unharmed. And when a team from Cambridge University, of which Secord was a part, conducted an appraisal, they realized that the artifacts were authentic. According to reports, everything from the ink to the paper indicated that these were the same objects that had once been in Darwin's possession. Ultimately, it was enough to convince Secord that the notebooks were authentic, despite the bizarre circumstances of their reappearance. You're talking about hundreds of pages that would be very hard to forge completely, he explained. And you can't go out and buy a notebook from 1837 down at your local stationery store. With the provenance of the notebooks confirmed, it was time for a celebration. In a post on Cambridge University's website, Gardner stated, "My sense of relief at the notebook's safe return is profound and almost impossible to adequately express. Along with so many others all across the world, I was heartbroken to learn of their loss, and my joy at their return is immense. The sole aim of our public appeal was to have the manuscript safely returned to our safekeeping, and I am delighted to have had such a successful outcome in such a relatively short space of time," Gardner continued. To her, there's little doubt that the decision to speak out led directly to the notebook's reappearance. Everyone at the library was incredibly touched by the response to our appeal, and to know that so many others felt the same sense of loss, we did only reaffirmed our decision to ask the public for their help, Gardner revealed. We believe that this decision has had a direct bearing on the notebooks being returned, and we'd like to take this opportunity to give the public our heartfelt thanks. In fact, the team at Cambridge University were so delighted that they decided to place the recovered items on display, with the books taking center stage in an exhibition due to launch in July 2022. For the first time, members of the public will be able to see the documents close up, offering a remarkable insight into Darwin's life and work. They may be tiny, just the size of postcards, but the notebooks' impact on the history of science and their importance to our world-class collections here cannot be overstated, Gardner said. And Secord agreed that the artifacts will offer audiences a whole new perspective on Darwin. The notebooks can help people to connect with Darwin's theory and this process that he goes through when he's doing his research, Secord told NPR. That really is invaluable. But as university officials prepare the documents for display, the question of who stole them in the first place remains unanswered. As the notebooks went missing from the library's archives, it seems there's a strong possibility that the theft might have been an inside job. But was it an opportunistic thief who had a change of heart once they saw how much the artifacts meant to so many people? Or was it the publicity surrounding the crime that ultimately forced their hand? After all, it would have been difficult for anyone to sell on the notebooks once the story of the theft became widely known. At the moment, the authorities are continuing to look into the disappearance, though no suspects have yet been announced. Many people have also pondered the meaning behind the message found alongside the artifacts. Printed, rather than handwritten, the note simply read "Librarian. Happy Easter" and was signed with a kiss. So far, there have been no other hints as to who might have made off with the notebooks, only to return them 2 decades down the line. Were they a former employee, perhaps, finally overcome with guilt after all these years? Or a student attempting to make amends for a prank that got out of hand? Whatever the identity of the thief, staff at Cambridge University are thrilled to have the notebooks back home at last. And they've been taking steps to ensure that something similar never happens again. In the statement, Gardner discussed the security protocols that have been put in place in the decades following the artifact's disappearance. The building has transformed significantly since the notebooks were first reported as missing, Gardner explained. In the last 20 years, this has included completion of new high-security strong rooms, new specialist reading rooms, and a range of additional security measures. Now, visitors to the library are monitored by CCTV and must use a special card to gain access to restricted areas. After all, Darwin's notebooks are far from the only things of value kept within Cambridge University Library and its 17-story building. In fact, there are around 10 million artifacts stored inside the structure, including a 4,000-year-old Sumerian tablet and a rare Ethiopic manuscript, one of only a handful found worldwide. Gardner and her co-workers, then, must be constantly vigilant lest another high-profile artifact goes mysteriously astray. Still, she doesn't believe that what happened in 2001 would be repeated today. Speaking to the BBC, she said, "Now if anything of this scale and significance was not found, we would be going to the police." Cambridge University's Vice-Chancellor, Stephen J. Toop, has also expressed his relief at the outcome. In a statement, he said, "I am incredibly glad to hear of the notebook's safe return to their rightful home, alongside the rest of the university library's remarkable Darwin archives. Objects such as these are crucial for our understanding of not only the history of science, but the history of humankind." Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.